My name is Warren Voss. I am 70 years old, and I am still somehow processing the deepest betrayal a father can survive. I spent my whole life building an industrial electrical contracting empire out of nothing, a company worth more than $55 million today. And last month, at a dinner meant to honor my late wife, my only son slammed his scotch glass down on the table, pointed his finger in my face, and hissed 4 words at me. "Stop wasting my money." I did not scream. I simply looked at him in dead silence. And the very next day, I emptied every single account he believed he controlled, and I disappeared completely. Before I tell you exactly how I did it, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who badly underestimated your worth. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday evening in November in Milwaukee, the kind of freezing wind that cuts straight through an overcoat and settles into your bones, much like the grief I still carry every day. We were seated in a dim, high-end steakhouse downtown, and I was paying, of course. I always paid. The dinner was meant to be a sacred occasion, marking the 3rd anniversary of the passing of my wife, Lorraine. Lorraine was my rock. She stood beside me when I was a 20-something kid hauling heavy conduit and panel boxes out of a rusted Ford van, working 90-hour weeks just to keep our lights on. Through decades of grit and sacrifice, we grew a 1-truck operation into Voss Electric and Controls, a $55 million enterprise. And now, at this luxurious table, it was just me, my 35-year-old son Bryce, and his wife Kendra. Bryce had taken over as chief executive officer of the company exactly 1 year earlier. I had stepped back to the title of chairman, believing it was finally time to let the next generation lead. Kendra, a former real estate agent with a dangerous taste for designer labels and exclusive country clubs, sat beside him, sipping an expensive glass of imported wine, looking bored and completely detached from the meaning of the evening. Soft jazz played, crystal glasses clinked at other tables, but our table felt suffocatingly heavy. Bryce had been distant and arrogant for months, and I had made excuses for him, telling myself he was just adjusting to the pressure of running a large company. I was wrong. When the waiter cleared our plates and poured the last of the wine, I decided it was the right moment to share a decision that had brought me a rare bit of comfort during a hard week of mourning. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my leather checkbook, and I set it gently on the white tablecloth. I looked at Bryce, searching desperately for a trace of his mother in his eyes. "I have been thinking about your mom all week," I said, my voice low and steady. "You know how much she loved the old community center on the east side, the one where she ran her adult literacy program for 20 years. The building flooded last spring, and it has been sitting gutted ever since. So tonight, to honor her memory, I am going to write a check for $60,000 from my personal savings to rebuild it." I expected a nod. I expected a shared moment of grief for the woman who gave him life. Instead, the reaction was instant and violent. Bryce snatched his heavy crystal scotch glass and slammed it down so hard the stem shattered in his grip, the crack echoing through the elegant room as nearby diners turned to stare. He leaned across the table, his face a furious red, the veins bulging in his neck, and he thrust his finger into my face. "Stop wasting my money," he hissed, the venom carrying clearly over the jazz. "What are you doing writing 60 grand checks to some flooded community center? Are you losing your mind?" Under the table, I heard a sharp thud as Kendra kicked his shin, her eyes darting around at the wealthy onlookers, panicking at the attention. But Bryce's hateful glare stayed locked on me, his chest heaving under the custom Italian jacket that the empire I built had paid for. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands. I did not yell. I simply froze, staring into the eyes of the stranger across from me, as 4 words roared in my mind. My money. He had just called my personal savings, the money I bled for over 4 decades, his money. I had spent 28 years breathing toxic fumes in mechanical rooms and freezing on rooftops in the dead of winter, sacrificing my own health so this boy would never taste poverty. I stepped back from the daily grind for 1 single year, and in that short time, his entitlement had mutated into something monstrous. He truly believed he owned my wealth. He truly believed he owned me. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the old man to explode and put his disrespectful son in his place. But I am not a man who fights in public. I am a man who observes, calculates, and executes. I slid the checkbook back into my pocket. I stood up slowly, my posture perfectly straight. I pulled 2 crisp $100 bills from my wallet, dropped them onto the ruined tablecloth to cover the meal, and I turned my back on my son and walked out into the freezing Milwaukee night. I heard Kendra's voice behind me as I crossed the dining room, bright and loud and performative, telling the staring tables that everything was fine, that her father-in-law was simply tired, that grief was hard on a man his age. She was already building the story, right there in the restaurant, laying the first brick of the narrative they would use against me. Tired. Grieving. His age. I did not turn around. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and let them swing shut on the warmth and the jazz and the clink of glasses, and I stood for a moment on the cold sidewalk with the wind cutting through my coat. 40 years earlier, I had stood on a sidewalk much like this one, 26 years old, having just lost a contract that would have saved us, and Lorraine had squeezed my hand and told me that the men who count you out are the ones who never see you coming back. I could almost feel her hand in mine again. My son had counted me out over a plate of $40 steak. He was about to learn how much his mother had understood about survival, and how little he had inherited of it. The cold wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. My heart was broken, but it was beating with a new and terrible purpose. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that a war for my life had just begun, and I would not be its victim. I would be the architect of its ending. Driving home through the frozen city that night, my old, scarred knuckles aching on the wheel, my mind drifted back to the early years. Because men like Bryce have no idea what it took to build what they so casually try to steal. When Lorraine and I first married, we had nothing but that rusted Ford van and a stack of unpaid bills. I spent 14 hours a day crawling through mechanical rooms, pulling wire until my fingers bled, wiring up factories and hospitals and cold storage plants that prouder contractors refused to touch. Lorraine kept the books on a card table in our kitchen and answered the phone in her sweetest voice so nobody would guess how close to the edge we lived. She would drive down to the job site at 7 in the evening with a thermos of black coffee and 2 foil-wrapped sandwiches, and we would sit on the tailgate of that van, covered in grime, and talk about the future we were building for our boy. I promised her, more than once, that no one would ever take from Bryce what we had broken ourselves to give him. I never once imagined the one I would have to protect it from would be Bryce himself. I woke before dawn the next morning, decades of loading trucks at 4:30 having hardwired my clock, and I sat at the kitchen island of the sprawling brick estate that Lorraine and I bought 20 years ago, a house that felt like an empty museum without her. At 8 o'clock, the brass knocker echoed through the silent hall. Bryce and Kendra were on my porch. Bryce looked awful, pale and clammy and hung over, clutching a ridiculous gold-ribboned fruit basket. Kendra looked impeccable in cashmere, wearing a bright, forced smile that never reached her eyes. "Dad," Bryce croaked, his voice much smaller than the roar from the steakhouse. "Can we come in? We need to talk." Every instinct I owned, the same instincts that had saved my company from bankruptcy through 3 recessions, told me to shut the door in their faces. But a good businessman never closes a door until he knows exactly what the other person is trying to sell him. So I let them in. Bryce shoved the fruit basket into my hands, and they perched on the edge of my sofa like guilty teenagers outside a principal's office. I offered them nothing, not coffee, not water. I simply folded my hands and waited. Because in a negotiation, the first person to break the silence is the one who loses, and I have the patience of stone. Bryce cracked first, burying his face in his hands for a theatrical second. "Dad, I am so sorry about last night," he began, his voice heavy with manufactured remorse. "My behavior was unacceptable. It is just the stress. The pressure of running Voss Electric is eating me alive. We are expanding into 2 new markets at once, and the supply chain is a nightmare. I had too much scotch on an empty stomach, and I snapped. That is not who I am." I listened, analyzing every syllable. He was blaming the alcohol. He was blaming the supply chain. He was blaming the very company I had handed him on a silver platter. He was taking no genuine accountability for the entitlement that had poured out of his mouth. Then Kendra leaned forward, laid a manicured hand on his knee, and looked at me with sickeningly sweet concern. "It is the truth, Warren," she said, her voice pure velvet. "Bryce has been working himself to the bone to make you proud. But honestly, we are both so worried about you. You have been living alone in this huge house for 3 years now, and grief does strange things to the mind. You are so generous, sometimes too generous. We keep reading these awful reports about scammers preying on wealthy older men who live alone, people who exploit grief to extract large donations. When you pulled out that checkbook, Bryce just panicked because he wants to protect you. He meant our family money, not his money." "That is exactly why we quietly took the initiative to set up a family protection trust last week," Kendra added smoothly. "Just to shield your personal assets from potential scammers. It is a standard safety measure for older, high-net-worth individuals." I nodded slowly, softening the hard lines of my face, pretending to accept their rehearsed apology. But deep in my chest, 40 years of business instinct were screaming a warning. The phrase "family protection trust" did not sound like a shield. It sounded like a permanent, unbreakable cage. After they finally left with their hollow apologies and their absurd fruit basket, the silence of the house felt heavier than before. I stood in the living room Lorraine had decorated with her own hands, looking at the photographs on the mantel, and I let myself see the whole shape of it. The apology had not been an apology at all. It had been reconnaissance. They had come to gauge whether I had understood what happened at that dinner, whether the old man was frightened, whether he would fold quietly. Kendra's talk of scammers and elder fraud had not been concern. It had been rehearsal, the exact language they intended to use in a courtroom to describe me. And the Family Protection Trust was not protection. It was a door swinging shut. Lorraine used to tell me that I could read a balance sheet better than any man alive, but that I was blind as a stone when it came to the people I loved, because love made me generous, and generosity made me easy to fool. She was right. For a year, I had made excuse after excuse for my son. Standing in her living room, with her photograph watching me, I finally stopped. I needed to be somewhere real. So, I went to the detached garage and pulled the canvas cover off my vintage 1979 Ford pickup, forest green, bought new with cash from my first big contract. A machine of honest steel with no touchscreens and no digital trackers. I fired up the engine and drove to a small mechanic shop on the industrial edge of town for a winter tune-up I had scheduled weeks before. The shop belonged to a man named Manny, a man who worked with his hands and understood the value of hard labor. When the job was done, I handed Manny my credit card, the black metal one I had carried for 15 years. He ran it, frowned, and ran it again. "Warren, I am really sorry," he said, turning the little terminal toward me. "It is coming back declined, both times." I kept my face perfectly calm. "Must be a glitch with the bank, Manny," I said smoothly, pulling cash from my wallet to cover it. "Give me a moment. I will call my attorney." I stepped outside into the biting cold and dialed Gordon Pike, my lawyer of 30 years, a man I trusted more than most of my own blood. I told him about the dinner, the fruit basket, the family protection trust, and the declined card. Gordon went very quiet, and when he spoke, his voice had a grim edge I had only heard a handful of times in 3 decades. He told me to meet him immediately at a diner off the highway, away from the office, away from anyone. An hour later, he slid into the booth across from me, ordered a black coffee, and opened a battered laptop right there on the sticky table. He connected to a secure hotspot and began digging, bypassing the public search engines, going straight into county records and restricted judicial databases. I watched his jaw tighten. "The Family Protection Trust is real, Warren," he said, "but it is not a shield. It is a financial vacuum. They structured it as an ironclad, irrevocable trust, naming Bryce as controlling trustee and Kendra as beneficiary. And they have already funneled the vast majority of your liquid assets into it." I sat very still while he explained the elegance of it, because it was elegant, in the way a well-built trap is elegant. Irrevocable meant I could not undo it, not even with my own signature, because in the eyes of the trust, I no longer had a valid signature to give. Controlling trustee meant Bryce could move my money at will while owing me the legal duty of a caretaker, and beneficiary meant that everything flowing out the far end landed softly in Kendra's manicured hands. They had not smashed a window and grabbed the silver. They had quietly rewired the entire house so that every switch I flipped now turned on a light in their kitchen. It was, I had to admit, exactly the kind of thing I might have designed myself, if I had ever been the kind of man who steals from the people who love him. But I was not, and that difference, in the end, was the one variable they never thought to account for. He kept typing, his face growing darker. "But this is the part that terrifies me. To move your money without your signature, they needed legal authority over you. So they got it. Warren, they filed for and were granted an emergency conservatorship. They convinced a judge that you are mentally incapacitated." The word landed like a hammer. "A conservatorship is the nuclear option," Gordon said quietly. "They legally declared that you are no longer a functioning adult capable of managing your own affairs. To pull that off, they needed a licensed physician to sign a sworn affidavit confirming severe cognitive decline. This was planned for months." He opened a new tab, typed in the address of my estate, and waited for the county deed record to load. Then he took a slow, heavy breath and turned the laptop toward me. There, in official black and white, was the deed to the home where Lorraine and I raised our family, the home I paid off 20 years ago. My name was gone. In its place, as sole owners, were Bryce and Kendra Voss. The transfer was dated 3 weeks ago. My signature had been flawlessly forged. My blood ran cold. I had not just lost my accounts and my company. If I drove home right now and confronted them, they could legally call the police and have me arrested for trespassing in my own house. Gordon watched me absorb it, and to his credit, he did not offer me hollow comfort. He simply laid out the shape of the cage. A conservatorship is not a lock you can pick with an angry phone call, he told me. On paper, in the eyes of the state, I was no longer a competent adult. Anything I said in my own defense could be waved away as the confusion of a declining mind. If I stormed into a bank and demanded my money, I would be the erratic old man the affidavit described. If I stood on my own porch and shouted, I would be proving their case for them. They had not just stolen my assets, they had stolen my voice, my credibility, my legal standing to even object. It was the most elegant and vicious thing I had ever seen, and my own son had signed his name to it. For one long moment, sitting in that greasy booth, I felt something I had not felt since the day the doctors told me Lorraine had 6 months. I felt genuinely, completely alone. And then, slowly, that feeling turned into something far more useful. It turned into resolve. I drove to a cheap motel on the county line and paid cash, and I sat on the lumpy mattress staring at the wall. But panic is a luxury a man in my position cannot afford. I had built an empire from a rusted van, and I had not done it by weeping over collapsed structures. When a system fails, you do not shout at the wreckage. You find the single point of failure, and you cut it. I sat in that motel room until 3 in the morning, and instead of grief, I let cold arithmetic fill me. They had built their whole scheme on one arrogant assumption, the same assumption Bryce had thrown in my face at the steakhouse. They believed that because I had handed him the title of chief executive, I had handed him the machine itself. But a title is not control. A title is a nameplate on a door. Bryce ran the company the way a man drives a car he did not build, confident at the wheel, utterly ignorant of the engine underneath him. He could see the accounts on his dashboard. He could move money between the drawers he knew about. What he could not see, because I had never shown him, was the wiring behind the walls, the founder's architecture I had laid into the company's bones back when he was still learning to walk. They had stolen the house, the trust, the conservatorship, everything on paper, but they had never once found the main breaker. And a man who does not know where the breaker is should never be so quick to insult the electrician. Bryce and Kendra had made one enormous mistake. They looked at a gray-haired chairman and assumed the man who founded the company no longer understood how it truly worked. But I did not just build Voss Electric. I built its bones. I designed its financial architecture. I wrote the security protocols for its servers with my own hands. And I never once handed over the master override key. Because a founder who gives away every key is a founder waiting to be robbed. Bryce controlled the accounts he could see. He had no idea about the ones underneath them. So that night, after the building went dark, I let myself into the corporate headquarters I had built, walked down to the server room in the sub-basement, and connected to the master registry. Walking those halls in the dark was its own strange grief. I passed the lobby where I had hung the first dollar the company ever earned, framed on the wall, now surrounded by glossy awards Bryce had bought for himself. I passed the boardroom where I had signed the contracts that wired half the hospitals in this city. I ran my hand along the cold concrete of the stairwell down to the sub-basement, a stairwell I had walked 10,000 times back when I still smelled of solder at the end of every day. The server room was exactly where I left it, humming behind a heavy steel door that answered to a code my son had never bothered to change. I was 70 years old, breaking into my own life in the middle of the night, and I felt no fear at all. Only a cold, focused calm. The same calm I used to feel standing beneath a dead high-voltage panel, knowing that if my hands were steady and my mind was clear, the power would do exactly what I told it to. I was not there to vandalize. I was there to read. I pulled up the master ledger for the third quarter, and at a glance, it looked perfectly clean. Payroll matched, supplier invoices matched. Someone skilled had painted a beautiful, fraudulent picture. But I did not build this company by looking at the surface. I isolated the outgoing vendor payments and filtered them by the exact month Bryce became CEO, and the true story surfaced immediately. Hidden beneath the legitimate purchases of copper wire and switchgear, there was a steady, rhythmic bleed, a recurring weekly wire of $45,000 to an entity called Apex Freight Solutions, coded as expedited logistics fees. Apex did not exist in our vendor database before last year. It was a shell company registered to a mailbox in Delaware. Apex was only the beginning. I uncovered 5 more ghost entities, each a fabricated shell siphoning hundreds of thousands out of our operating capital under vague consulting fees. Over 12 months, Bryce had embezzled nearly $4 million straight from the company I built. It was staggering. But $4 million against $40 million in revenue should have hurt our margins, not threatened the whole structure. And yet the cash flow indicators were flashing severe red. The company was drowning in a liquidity crisis that $4 million could not explain. So I dug into the collateral registries, holding my breath as the encrypted files decrypted, and what I found made the embezzlement look like a rounding error. Bryce had taken the physical assets of Voss Electric, the machinery, the warehouses, the fleet of 300 trucks, and pledged all of it against massive, highly leveraged offshore margin accounts. He was borrowing tens of millions from unregulated international lenders, using the lifeblood of my company as the guarantee, and he was pouring that borrowed money into high-risk foreign currency bets, playing financial roulette with the foundation of everything I had ever built. If those margin calls came due and he could not cover them, the offshore lenders would legally seize every asset tied to the Voss name. The warehouses, the trucks, the tools right out of my employees' hands. My son had strapped a financial bomb to the core of the company, and the timer was already ticking. And it was not only my name that would be buried when it went off. I thought about the 300 people whose livelihoods hung on those pledged trucks. I thought about the men in the shop who had been with me 20 years and were counting on the pension I had built for them. I thought about the young apprentices Bryce had never once bothered to learn the names of, kids from the same rough neighborhoods I had come up in, who believed this company was a place where a person could build an honest life. Bryce had gambled every one of them on a currency bet, without their knowledge and without their consent, to feed a lifestyle and cover a hole he had dug with his own hands. This was the man who had lectured me about wasting money on a flooded community center that his own mother had loved. The hypocrisy was so total, so breathtaking, that my grief finally burned off entirely and left behind nothing but a clear, cold, working mind. And in that freezing server room, gripping the metal rack until my knuckles went white, I finally understood the dinner. He had looked me in the eye and screamed about me wasting his money because he was projecting his own catastrophic ruin onto me. He needed the Family Protection Trust to swallow my personal wealth because he had already gambled away the corporate wealth, and he was desperate to plug the hole before it swallowed him. His whole cruel performance was the flailing of a drowning man. I copied every ledger, every shell company, every offshore file, and the forged medical affidavit their bought doctor had signed onto a hardened drive, and I wiped my footprint from the registry. Then I did the thing they never imagined the senile old fool could do. From that same master terminal, using the founder's override they did not know existed, I reached into the corporate holding account that fed everything. The account Bryce believed was his to command. And I moved it. Every liquid dollar, routed in seconds through channels I had built decades ago, out of their reach, and into a protected structure only I could touch. I locked the holding account behind the founder's key, and the personal accounts Bryce and Kendra had funded almost entirely with embezzled money and offshore loans, the accounts that flowed from the company I still legally anchored, I drained and froze on my way out the door. By the time the sun came up, the money they thought they controlled was simply gone, and every account they had used to rob me showed a balance of 0. I was not stealing. I was reclaiming, and I was leaving a clean, complete trail for the people who would come next. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do, because it matters. I did not touch a single dollar that belonged to an employee, a supplier, or the pension fund. I did not siphon anything into some offshore box of my own the way my son had. Every dollar I moved into a protected legal structure with my name on it and a full record of where it came from, so that when the investigators followed the money, they would find it sitting in daylight, waiting for them, exactly where the rightful owner had placed it. The $4 million Bryce had bled into his shell companies I could not recover in an hour, but I did not need to. I only needed to freeze the machine before he could feed it the last thing left to gamble, which was me. He had built his entire escape on the belief that my personal fortune would flow into his trust and paper over the crater he had blown in the company. I simply made sure that when he reached for it, his hand closed on nothing at all. In the morning, I drove back to the estate one last time. I did not go to fight. I let myself in quietly, walked past the marble foyer and the grand kitchen Lorraine had loved, and I packed a single duffel bag, a few clothes, her photograph, and nothing else that carried the poison of that house. Before I left, I made one phone call to a field agent Gordon had connected me with at the FBI, and I handed over the encrypted drive, the whole architecture of my son's fraud laid bare, the embezzlement, the offshore collateralization, and the forged conservatorship that had declared a healthy man insane. Then I walked out the front door and pulled it shut, and the latch clicked like a seal on a tomb they had dug for themselves. I climbed into my old Ford, tossed the bag on the seat, and turned the heavy key. The engine roared, strong and unburdened. I pulled away from the estate without a shred of regret, merged onto the interstate, and pointed the truck south, toward the warm Gulf Coast, toward a place where the cold of betrayal could not reach me. I had been driving a couple of hours when a cheap burner phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a phone I had bought with cash the night before, strictly for this one moment. I picked it up and lifted it to my ear without a word. "Dad, what did you do?" Bryce screamed, his voice cracking into pure panic. I listened to the beautiful sound of his world collapsing. "The money is gone. I tried to move the holding account, and it is locked. My personal accounts say 0. We have nothing. And the FBI is in the lobby of headquarters right now with warrants. They are seizing all the servers. Dad, please, you have to fix this." I kept my eyes on the long gray highway, and I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm of a man who had just pulled his own soul back out of the dark. "You told me to stop wasting your money, Bryce," I said. "I did exactly that. I secured the funds, I exposed your conservatorship, and I handed your offshore ledgers to the federal government. I am simply honoring your request to step aside." Enjoy your bankruptcy, son. Then I ended the call, snapped the phone in half, and threw the pieces out the window into the gravel. I did not feel triumph in that moment. People imagine that a story like mine ends in some clean, satisfying joy, and it does not. When I hung up on my son, I was hanging up on a small boy I had once carried on my shoulders through the state fair, a boy who had fallen asleep in the cab of my work truck 100 times, a boy his mother had believed would grow into a good man. That boy was gone, and I had helped bury him. And no amount of justice makes a father's hand steady while he does that. But there is a difference between mourning your child and being devoured by him. And somewhere in that freezing server room, I had finally learned to tell the two apart. The morning sun crested the horizon and washed golden light across the windshield, melting away the last of the cold nightmare I had escaped. In the weeks that followed, the conservatorship was voided the moment a real court saw a healthy, sharp 70-year-old man testify against a bought affidavit. Bryce and Kendra were indicted for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery, and the offshore lenders and federal prosecutors began circling the wreckage of everything they had tried to steal. The company survived, restructured under people who had actually earned their place in it, and every worker kept the tools in their hands. The physician who had signed the false affidavit lost his license and joined my son on the indictment, because a doctor who will declare a healthy man insane for a fee has already declared himself something worse. Kendra, who had once told a courtroom she was a devoted daughter-in-law worried about my failing mind, filed for divorce the same week the seizures began, having discovered that a bankrupt felon made a far less appealing husband than a company heir. And the community center that Lorraine loved, the one flooded building that had started this entire war, I rebuilt after all. I wrote the check from a clean account in a warm state, and I put her name over the door, and I asked no one for permission. It cost $60,000. It was the best money I have ever spent, and no one alive will ever again tell me it was theirs to withhold. As for me, I was stripped of a title I no longer wanted, and I had never felt more free. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson beneath it is as real as copper and current. I spent 50 years wiring buildings, and if that trade taught me one thing, it is that no matter how the power runs through a house, somebody always holds the main breaker. My son forgot that the man who built the system is the man who can shut it off. Love your family, but never let devotion blind you to greed, because blind trust is a weapon you hand to your enemies. A real legacy is not a mountain of cash left for ungrateful heirs. It is your dignity, your clear mind, and the courage to walk away and keep them. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they earned with their own hands. My name is Warren Voss, and everything I built, I kept exactly where it belonged.